I kind of came into museum education through the back door in a way. I was working in a studio art department. My master's degree is in painting. And because I was taking my students to museums, I met this profession called museum education. And the museum educators that I work with were just wonderful.
And it was that very immediate experience with objects from the past that just captivated me in terms of the power that these objects have to teach us about the people who came before us.
By just seeing one or two artifacts, hearing a story, the atmospherics of what an exhibit can do for your imagination is just really captivating and inspirational, and I think that's what made me want to go down that path.
Philadelphia Museum of Art has a wonderful collection, and so I've sort of cut my teeth there. I was teaching school programs every day from like 9 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. School groups coming through the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and that was an excellent experience to be on the floor like that.
At the age of 22, I was shocked to realize that somebody would pay me to do a job that was this fun.
I started my career as a museum educator in 1970, but for the last almost 30 years, a partner in a firm called Management Consultants for the Arts. When I started out in museum education, EdCom didn't exist, and although museum education had existed for a long time, there were certainly no graduate programs or any kind of formal training. In 1970, I came to museum education as an instructor, having taught at the Fashion Institute of Technology and taught informally in art galleries. And the way I learned to be a museum educator was to follow around the museum educator who had had the position prior to me.
I have spent my entire professional career working in museums as a museum educator and curator and director, serving in at the Bay Area Discovery Museum, at the Seattle Museum, the New Orleans Museum of Art, and of course the Winnipeg Art Gallery. So from 1968. So we're talking about 45-year commitment to this profession.
EdCom began in around 1980 when I was the research assistant for the Commission on Museums for the Century at the American Association of Museums.
The museum sent me to Minneapolis in 1973 to the American Association of Museums annual meeting. Met a number of radical, especially young women of my age, who were museum educators, and we wondered where our voice was in the museum, and more particularly at the annual conference. And this led to a whole series of conversations that resulted in the formation of the Standing Professional Committee of Museum Education, which we're celebrating today.
April or May of 1974, I was a keynoter at an AAM conference in Milwaukee, and being the always troublemaker and young Turk that I was, I complained about the fact that there was no way in which museum educators interacted with each other, even communicated, talked with each other, met with each other. And that was essentially what my keynote was about.
We went on the floor of the annual meeting and would not sit down, and got a petition that we brought to the floor approved, and it was an extraordinary event because even though the gap was being hit, and the president at that time kept saying, all of you people, basically men and women, sit down and stop disrupting our meeting. And after a long discussion, a very distinguished colleague of our profession, Mike Spock and Sherman Lee, rose up, and they were both museum directors, and they said, no, we think that you should seriously listen to the voice of the educators.
We formed a committee. Richard Muehlberger, who had been in museum education longer than I, became the president of EdCom. I don't even remember whether that was the actual name 40 years ago. I was the vice president, and at the business meeting, they had to vote on whether we could start EdCom or not. There was great antipathy towards it. The museum directors present were generally not interested, except for two. Michael Spock of the Boston Children's Museum and Helmuth Naumer, who is no longer alive, and I don't even remember what museum he directed then, but the two of them really convinced the members of AAM or their board, whatever it was, to vote in EdCom. And the rest is history.
And the next thing you know, that we were born as the Standing Professional Committee, and it was a combination of these wonderful leaders in the profession who took a role and a voice, and a group of radical men and women. After all, a lot of us were coming out of the 60s women's liberation movement, and we just didn't understand the word no or sit down.
EdCom as an entity and as a very critical organization really got started, and it coincided with the Education Roundtable in New York City, with Museum Education Roundtable in DC, with the start of the GW Museum Education program.
And at that time, what was a really top of mind issue was the relationship between education and the collections responsibilities of museums.
And it was an extraordinary moment because the dialogue at the board level began to change from more administrative matters to really the role of museums in society. And very importantly, a series of publications came out on that were supported and funded in part by the AAM, whether they wanted to or not. They just couldn't say no to us. So Adults, Museums, and the Humanities, probably a book nobody in your generation ever read, but it was a radical idea to look cross-divisionally at museums and think about the role of the visitor. A book I wrote called Museums, Magic, and Children. It was a whole flourishing of conferences and programs that we were able to nurture. I served on and off the board of AAM from the 70s until 2008.
I first joined the EdCom board in about 1985 or 1986 when I was nominated to be the vice chair, and then served 2 terms as the chair of the committee.
Being the first museum educator on the AAM's accreditation commission. And then I went on for 6 years and chaired the accreditation commission, which was singularly the most demanding volunteer job I've ever had, but more importantly, the most extraordinary experience because I learned so much about the field.
I feel as if I've grown up with EdCom. It's been a way for me to understand how important it is for people to be active in the professional organizations, because EdCom really came into being. It was the first standing professional committee because people like Bonnie and Elaine Gurian and Linda Sweet, or a whole group of people who recognized how important it was to advocate for museum education within the American Association of Museums. And a large part of that was organizing museum educators across the country to nominate and elect members of the board of the American Association of Museums.
And I was so thrilled to discover a group of like-minded peers, and I still have very close friends from that moment. Having been a museum educator served me extremely well. That's because the job of a director is primarily that of an educator, as it turns out.
I think one of the things that has guided me all throughout my career, first as a museum educator and now as a museum director, has been the network of professional connections and friendships And EdCom played a huge and significant part in providing me the entree into serving the field as a volunteer, and then sustaining me for many years to come. My first experience with EdCom was kind of an accident. My then supervisor was on the board of the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums and was the regional representative from the Mid-Atlantic region to the EdCom board. And he was unable to make a meeting, and he sent me in his place. And I guess I was hooked.
I know that I just looked up tremendously to people like Bonnie Pittman and Elaine Gurian and Helene, and it's so wonderful. You know, Bonnie became a director herself, and uh, Elaine has been continues to be such an influence in the museum profession. So it's hard with all those years passing by and all those many moments of EdCom to remember anyone in particular. I think more than moments, I remember passionate people.
I remember that during that time, we were continuing the work that Patty Williams had started with establishing standards for educators in museums. It was our task, after the work that Patty had done with so many people, to get that into an edited document and have it published and distributed. It was also during that time that excellence and equity was being developed as a policy, and so as the chair of EdCom, I served on that excellence and equity task force.
And we had been roundly criticized as a profession at a certain point for not having a theory, for not having a body of literature. And this was something that I took very personally. So I think we worked very hard to get a number of publications out and to really establish a journal and to establish a kind of theoretical foundation for the work that we're doing.
Excellence and equity was a radical idea. It gave voice, it gave a voice to the public dimension of museums and empowered everybody in the whole field, directors, curators, educators, to go this shift. And out of that came enormous funding from federal agencies, governments, foundations that poured into the museum field, trying to help them to flourish in these new ways.
So as soon as Excellence in Equity was published, I ordered a box to be delivered to the museum, and they were distributed to our trustees and also all the other staff at the museum, and we used that as a guide to help us develop a long-range plan for the museum.
And I think the education was a bit of a latecomer onto the scene as being a purposeful part of the museum plan. That's changed so tremendously in the past 40 years. I mean, now education is central to everything that we do. It's central to what grant makers expect to see. It's central to our exhibition themes and to the impact that we make on our communities. And EdCom really has an important national role for helping cultivate and set those standards. What are the standards? What are our best practices? Sharing ideas. There are so many amazing things that happen from museums across the country. It's a conduit to bring people together to learn about those things.
I didn't join EdCom until really late in my career. I mean, I'd always signed up for that extra membership cost when I was an AAM member. So, but I felt, you know, by the time I got to the sort of later stages of my career, I thought I'd better give something back a little bit. So I was elected to be a member at large.
I realized that I really enjoyed being involved with AAM as a larger organization, networking with other people, getting involved in professional development, building my own skill sets through the work I was doing with EMP. So when I kind of aged out of that, EdCom seemed like the next natural progression to continue my involvement with AAM.
Chairing the EdCom Communications Committee, and then being EdCom chair from 2000 to 2004.
I thought I just want to be more involved in what this organization is doing. In addition to that, the sessions that were presented I really admired how professionally they were done, and I thought that's an area I want to know more about. How do people become presenters? How do they come up with the session ideas? How do they work with their co-presenters to put together a coherent presentation that holds people's attention, shares information, and does it in a lively, engaging way? So I guess those were my 2 points of entry to AAM.
And I was privileged to be a part of the discussions that helped set the stage for the new AAM strategic plan and the work that the association has done over the past 5 or so years.
Well, I'm now the Vice Chair of Issues for EdCom, and the primary role that I've been doing for the last couple of years is helping to lead the new strategic planning mission. So we have revised our strategic plan. We're now talking about how do we carry out those tasks, what kinds of things do we need to do to position ourselves within the broader education community and work with the American Alliance of Museums to make sure that education is central to everything that we do.
Probably one of the most significant moments, I would say, in EdCom's history was the publication in 2002 of Excellence in Practice, because I think it was helpful in kind of professionalizing the field, or not necessarily professionalizing it, but articulating that the field is a professional area where you are required to have expertise to be a museum educator.
The publication of EdCom's Excellence in Practice, the standards and best practices for museum educators and museum education, was a really wonderful point. It was a coming together of many points of view and a really rigorous look at the work that we do as museum educators in the larger context of the museum field.
I think EdCom just broadens your world. It gives you opportunities you probably wouldn't have in your day-to-day working life, and you can bring all that back to your job, and I think it makes you better able to do what you need to do, keeping in mind not only your day-to-day responsibilities, but also what's happening in the field and where is it heading in the future.
EdCom for me personally has been a really good opportunity to meet people from around the country and to learn about the things that people are doing in museums, big and small, in cities, tiny and large. And through my role with EdCom, I really get to learn about a lot of the programs that people are doing by reviewing session proposals for the annual meeting. But I also think that EdCom is really important for me because it kind of gives me a sense of the macro view of museum education, because the people at AAM are really good about talking to us about not just kind of internally how museum education is viewed within our institutions, but also outside of the field how museum education is viewed, and making sure that people outside of museums know that museums really are essential educational institutions.
I am still involved with EdCom. I still love reading all the conversations that go on the listserv, etc. I became secretary of EdCom for several years. Again, my memory fails me, but it was a wonderful organization to be involved in. And in 1988, I received EdCom's Excellence Award, and it was just one of my proudest moments. It still is. I still have it on my bookshelf over there in the back.
There are things that we need to preserve about all the work that kind of our predecessors have done to raise the profile of education within museums. And I think that we've come a really long way since the article in the early 80s called The Uncertain Profession, where I think education really does have a higher profile within our institutions field-wide. But I also feel like we need to really hang on to that and preserve that so that this kind of blurring of the boundaries doesn't dilute all the work that we've done to articulate how professional our field is and how much expertise is required to do what we do, and the kind of knowledge that we have being the kind of liaison between the museum and the visitor.
I'm thrilled that they bring that same level of passion and commitment that I did to the field, but I also feel like they're really coming into a field that has much more of a sense of itself. where education is no longer the underdog that it had traditionally been when I started way back when in the 70s, where there's a great deal more respect. And there's just so much more wonderful material to work with, in the sense that technology has given us some opportunities that none of us had in the past.
For my generation coming into museum education, I kind of always took it for granted that museum education was a field and it was respected as a field and a discipline and an expertise. But I know now that that wasn't always the case, so I think all of us young people should be really grateful to the predecessors for laying that kind of groundwork and making a lot of progress over the past 30 so years, it seems like.
Be fearless and have courage. Go with passion in your heart to innovate and experiment. Don't just, you will fail and you will succeed, but you have to keep moving. And the most other thing I would say is learn from the past and find mentors who can help you, because there's a lot that has been accomplished and a lot more you can do if you build on strength.